Hey guys, so in the previous lecture we covered the arrow functions and how they can be used, how they can replace your traditional functions, what are the differences that are there between arrow functions and normal functions. But we did not talk about something called as IIFEs, which is immediately invoked function expressions. Now we already discussed the IIFEs in the previous lectures when we were talking about the let and the constant, and you can also see one example which is there on the screen right now. Now one popular use of IIFEs or functions is the IIFEs. Now, iife allows you to define an anonymous function and call it immediately without saving a reference. Now, this pattern comes in handy when you want to create a scope that is shielded from the rest of the program. In this code, you can see that iife is used to create an object with the get name. You can see that this is a method. Now the method uses the name argument of the return as the return value. So whatever was the name argument, that is the return value, effectively making name a private member of the returned object. So let's convert this function into a iife function into an arrow function. So the first thing that we'll have to do is, instead of the function keyword, we'll just give a parenthesis. Let's make sure, and let's close the parenthesis just before the block of the function, which is just before passing the argument as abhay. Now that's one part of it. Also make sure to pass in the arrow, because a function, arrow function, cannot be without an arrow, and that's why you saw the icon there. So everything worked, and you can still see abhay got printed onto the screen. Now this is the implementation of arrow functions for the IIFE. Now one of the most common areas of error in JavaScript is the binding of this inside of the function, since the value of this can change inside a single function depending on the context in which the function is called. It's possible to mistakenly affect the object when you meant to affect another object. Now let me give you a small example. I'll cut the video, I'll write the example, and I'll show it to you. Now I have commented out the console log that we previously had, and I've created a page handler actually. Now in this code, what you can see is the object page handler is designed in a way to handle the interactions of the page. Now this init method, which you see out here, this function out here, is basically called to set up the interactions, and the method also in turn assigns an event handler. You can see the click event handler is already there, and on click of the event it calls the do something method, which is defined out here, and of course it passes the type to it. So that's what exactly the code is intended to do. Now the call to this dot do something is broken because this is a reference to the object that was the target of the event. In this scenario it is the document. So you can see here this document was this object that you had, instead of being bound to the page handler that you would expect, because you want to use the page handler. Now if you try to run this code, you would get an error when the event handler fires, because this dot do something doesn't really exist on the target of document object. Now you could definitely fix this by binding this keyword with the page handler explicitly using the bind function, and that's very easy to do and achieve. So what you can do is, just before the false, you can just do a dot bind, and then you can pass this. Now that binding is done, and you should not get the error, so the error will go away. So you will just do a no error out here. So now the code will work definitely, but it may look a little strange. By calling the bind.this out here, you're actually creating a new function whose this is based or bound to the current this, which means the current this object that you see, which is the page handler. To avoid creating an extra function, a better way to fix this code is using the arrow function. So the arrow functions have no this binding, because that's what we talked about initially, that they do not have this, super, or probably new.target as well. So they do not have the this binding, which means the value of this inside an arrow function will only be determined by looking up the scope chain. So if the arrow function is contained within the non-arrow function, the this keyword will be the same as containing function. Otherwise the this keyword is equivalent to the value of this in the global scope. That's a lot of theory, I understand that. So let me quickly change the code and explain you a little bit in detail. So let's quickly change the code. So the first thing that we'll do is, instead of function event, we'll make this as just an event. And now this event will be on the left hand side of the arrow function, so that the right hand side can have a value. And instead of doing all this out here, what we will do is we will simply just do a this dot do something. Let me complete this something. Now once I have this dot, I'll do an event dot type, because that's the input, comma false, and let's close the event listener. Let me just bring this to the new line so it's easier to read. So that was the change that we made to our existing function. Now let me elaborate. So the event handler in this example, which is this event handler out here, is an arrow function. So you can see this is the arrow function, that's the event handler. Instead of passing the function initially, you're passing an arrow function. Now the value of this is the same as it is within the init. So whatever is the value of this out here, which means whatever is the value of this out here, you will see the same value of this inside too, which is inside this function out here. So the value is the same. Now, so this version of code works similarly to the one using the bind of this, even though the do something method doesn't return a value. So right now, do something doesn't return value, it will just do a console.log. Now it's still only a statement executed in the function body, and so there is no need to include the braces. You can definitely add braces to here, but you do not have to necessarily add braces. It is completely okay. Well, not exactly there, it should be here. So you may want to add the braces or you may not want to add the braces. It's completely your choice. Let me revert it back. Now arrow functions are also designed to be a throwaway function, and so you cannot, they cannot be used to define new types. So this is definitely evident when you're trying to, because there's no prototype in it, and whenever you try to do a new of an arrow function, probably you'll get an error. Let me show you an example. So variable my type is equals to an arrow function, let's say, and that's just an empty or anonymous arrow function, and then I'll create an object. My object is equal to new my type, which means it's of type my type. Now if I try to do this, I should get an exception, of course, because unexpected token equals, oh, this should be an arrow, my bad. Let me change that. Now let's go here in the console and see. My type is not a constructor because it doesn't have the construct method, it just has the call, because that's an arrow function. So make sure when you try to use an arrow function, you are very clear on not using the new keyword, because that will end up giving you an error. Now if you need to also, since this value, which is this keyword, this value is determined by containing function in which the arrow function is defined, you cannot change the value of this using call, apply, or bind. So the value will never change inside arrow function. That this will still remain the this which is there from the parent. So whatever was the value just in this example out here will be the same inside. So you can be rest assured that that's what you are expecting. So that was all about arrow functions and how the iifes work, as well as how you can call this keyword without it being getting updated. Now if you have any questions around this feel free to let me know in the Q&A section. I'll be very happy to answer your questions. I'll see you in the next class.